Hey, this is Ryan of Happy Healthy Vegan. Things have sure changed a lot in the past few years. In the past, before coronavirus, I responded to countless articles from the mainstream media spreading just so much disinformation, misinformation about veganism and plant-based diets, and I had to respond with facts and evidence to disprove what they were saying. Now, in the age of coronavirus, I'm starting to see this turn, and it's happening on a near daily basis. Articles are being published in mainstream news sources which are actually pro-veganism, anti-meat. Let me show you this latest story here from the New York Times, article entitled, "The End of Meat is Here." So this New York Times article begins by talking about the story that I discussed here on this channel just a couple weeks ago about how slaughterhouses across the United States were closing down because too many of their workers were contracting coronavirus. It was spreading amongst the workers there because they couldn't practice social distancing and they couldn't take time off if they're sick or else they'd be fired from their jobs. These workers were very exploited. So as a result, there have been some meat shortages and some Americans have been considering how essential meat is. And this article says, well, is meat more essential than the lives of the working poor who labor to produce it? It seems so. An astonishing 6 out of 10 counties that the White House itself identified as coronavirus hotspots are home to the very slaughterhouses that the president ordered open. And in my old video, I discussed the plant in South Dakota where around half its workers tested positive for coronavirus. And this New York Times article goes further. It says there's a Tyson plant in Iowa that had 730 cases of coronavirus, nearly 60% of their employees. And another Tyson plant in Waterloo, Iowa, where there were over 1,000 reported cases amongst its 2,800 workers. So as a result of all this sickness and coronavirus spreading through the slaughterhouses, many were forced to close down, others have scaled back production, which meant animals weren't being killed in the quantities that they were prior to coronavirus. And many vegans were pleased initially because we thought, hey, the animals aren't being killed at the slaughterhouse. That's a small win. Well, of course, it's not so simple because we're talking about the animal agriculture industry, which is one of the most horrific businesses ever to be on this planet. Of course, they're not freeing or releasing these animals. Farmers are instead euthanizing them by either gassing them or shooting them. So these animals are still being killed. And it's gotten so bad that Senator Chuck Grassley from Iowa, a Republican, has asked the Trump administration for mental health resources for hog farmers. So our current situation is forcing people to really consider if they should continue eating meat. Why should they needlessly put the lives of the slaughterhouse workers at risk when you don't need to eat meat? As I showed in my last video, meat is not essential. And we'll talk about it more later. You can be just fine. You can be a thriving human by eating nothing but plants. Anyway, this article continues next by painting some of the history of why animal agriculture is so bad for our planet. And strangely, they present some of the facts and data that I've been presenting in my response videos to the mainstream media's former misrepresentations about veganism. So as the Times writes, animal agriculture is now recognized as a leading cause of global warming. And as I'll show you in a moment, it's not a leading cause, it is the leading cause. They go on to say, according to The Economist, and I didn't know this statistic, a quarter of Americans between the ages of 25 and 34 say they are vegetarians or vegans, which is perhaps one reason sales of plant-based meats have skyrocketed, with Impossible and Beyond Burgers available everywhere from Whole Foods to White Castle. So this author brings up the metaphor of a hand reaching for the doorknob, moving to a more green world, a more plant-based world. Well, now COVID has just kicked that door wide open. He goes on to say, we cannot protect our environment while continuing to eat meat regularly. So I've been talking about all these years. So this is not a refutable perspective, as I'll show. It's a banal truism. Whether meat becomes Whoppers or boutique grass-fed steaks, cows produce an enormous amount of greenhouse gas. If cows were a country, I didn't know this stat, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. As the article said, it's irrefutable that eating meat and protecting the environment can't go hand in hand. And let me show you some data. Greenhouse gas emissions per calorie. Number 1 and 2 by far are beef, and look way down low are plants. And as far as greenhouse gas emissions goes, nothing is worse than animal agriculture. It's responsible for 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions, more than from all of transportation combined, and this data comes from the United Nations. Animal agriculture is the leading cause of species extinction, ocean dead zones, water pollution, and habitat destruction. And as climate change becomes more pronounced, water will become more precious, and we must get off animal agriculture because 55% of water consumed for the US is for animal agriculture. Compare that to just 5% for private homes. It could take up to 2,500 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef. And where does all the waste go? 130 times more animal waste than human waste is produced in the United States. 130 times, that's 1.4 billion tons. So some people might say, hey, we'll just eat fish then. Well, that's not a good choice either because most of the world's fisheries are either exploited or depleted, and we could see fishless oceans by 2048. And we all know how precious our rainforests are, and animal agriculture is responsible for up to 91% of the destruction of the Amazon. So back to the New York Times article, according to the research director of Project Drawdown, a nonprofit organization dedicated to modeling solutions to address climate change, eating a plant-based diet is, quote, the most important contribution every individual can make to reversing global warming. And this essentially parallels what the United Nations has been saying, that we immediately need to stop eating meat, at least eat way less meat if we want to have any hope of avoiding the worst impacts of climate change. Next, the article does a fantastic job addressing the sorts of responses meat eaters give as to why they don't want to give up their meat. They'll say, hey, I'm into the humane treatment of animals. And anyone who knows anything about how animals are treated in animal agriculture knows this is completely impossible. As the article says, we cannot claim to care about the humane treatment of animals while continuing to eat meat. The farming system we rely on is woven through with misery. Modern chickens have been so genetically modified that their very bodies have become prisons of pain even if we open their cages. Turkeys are bred to be so obese that they are incapable of reproducing without artificial insemination. Mother cows have their calves ripped from them before weaning, resulting in acute distress we can hear in their wails, I've shown this before, and empirically measured through the cortisol in their bodies, which is a stress hormone. Okay, so if you understand that the humane treatment of animals is impossible in animal agriculture, what about protein though? You hear that all the time, like where do you get your protein? It's not like plants are devoid of protein. Let me be the first to tell you that if you've never heard this, that all plants have protein. In fact, in the New York Times article, the author goes on to talk about how most American adults eat roughly twice the recommended intake of protein, including vegetarian. So it shows how it's quite easy to get your necessary protein in your diet, even if you're consuming just plants. I mean, I've been vegan now for almost 10 years, and I put my blood tests up here every 12 to 18 months. I'm not protein deficient. I'm not deficient in anything. And furthermore, don't take my word for it, take the word of the largest association of health professionals in the world, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, who state, after reviewing all the scientific literature, that appropriately planned vegan and vegetarian diets are nutritionally adequate for all people in all phases of life. So a second objection that this author anticipates is if we let the factory farm system collapse, won't farmers suffer? And a short answer, no. And that's because corporations dominate the American farming world now. This author points out that there were more farmers here in the United States during the Civil War than there are now, despite there being roughly 11 times more people living here now. He says that this is not an accident, but a business model. The ultimate dream of the animal agriculture industrial complex is for, quote, farms to be fully automated. Transitioning forward or toward plant-based food and sustainable farming practices would create many more jobs than it would end. And another objection that this author anticipates is the question, isn't a movement away from meat elitist? No. I've talked about this countless times on our channel. This author points out a 2015 study which found that a vegetarian diet is $750 a year cheaper than a meat-based diet. And he also points out that people of color disproportionately self-identify as vegetarian because it's more affordable, and disproportionately are victims of factory farming's brutality. I've had many people try to challenge me on this very issue, that vegan is elitist. I mean, yeah, some food is expensive, that's vegan, but you don't have to eat processed expensive food. I challenge people to point out what foods are more affordable per calorie than the foods that we eat here every day. I'm talking about grains, all various forms of rice, legumes, any kind of bean you can dream of, potatoes, and for fruits, bananas, it's not expensive to be vegan. And anyone who says otherwise is either really rich and is buying the most expensive vegan food that they can, or they're not vegan and just making stuff up. I personally really appreciate how the author is stating very clearly here that even though this is an opinion piece in the New York Times, what he's saying here is not opinion. These are irrefutable facts. He says, "These are not my opinions or anyone's opinions, despite a tendency to publish this information in opinion sections, and the answers to the most common responses raised by any serious questioning of animal agriculture aren't opinions. These are facts." So the author ends this article by returning to that earlier metaphor of the door, crossing through a door. He says, "On the other side of this door is not something new, but something that calls from the past, a world in which farmers were not myths, tortured bodies were not food, and the planet was not the bill at the end of the meal." So, I couldn't believe when I saw this article in the New York Times presenting facts, evidence, the truth that I've been speaking here for so many years in a publication that I've undoubtedly responded to so many times for doing the exact opposite of presenting so much misinformation about plant-based and vegan diets. So if it took a global pandemic to get this information just front and center to your American public, to the world public, presented in a major publication like this, speaking truth. Again, it's not just my opinion, even though I'm vegan, but this is based on fact, on evidence, in science, and get this information out to the people. I think more people would be even more interested in eating plant-based or even going vegan because it's so essential to our future. So anyway, leave your questions and comments down below. What do you think about, have you seen this recent turn in mainstream media presenting veganism and information that supports veganism in a truthful and therefore positive light? Let me know what your thoughts are. Is it just me? Comment down below, hit like, share this video, let YouTube know this video is cool and it needs to get out there, and share it with friends that need to see this information. So until next time, guys, let's keep staying vegan.